This video is sponsored by DevMountain. If you're interested in learning web development, iOS, or UX design, DevMountain is a 12-week design and development bootcamp intended to get you a full-time position in the industry. To learn more, visit devmountain.com or click the link in the description below. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my Nest JS crash course. So I've had a bunch of requests to do a video on Nest. I recently got into it. I really like it. I think there's a bunch of great features, and it can benefit a lot of people building full stack applications or building APIs. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what it is, and then jump in and create a REST API, and we're also going to hook up a MongoDB database, and we're going to use Mongoose, which interacts really well with Nest JS. So Nest is as you can see, a progressive Node.js framework for building efficient, reliable, and scalable server-side applications. So basically it sits on top of Express. Express is a very, very minimalistic framework, which is great by itself. However, it doesn't give you much structure. So Nest is a framework to use if you want to have a lot of structure on your back end. The syntax, the structure, it's very similar to Angular, which is a front-end framework. So it uses TypeScript, it uses services, it uses dependency injection in the same way that Angular does. It uses modules, controllers. You can generate controllers on the fly using the command line interface. So it's really powerful, and like I said, just gives you a lot of structure to your server side. So we're going to build a REST API. We're going to use Postman to make our requests. So if you're going to follow along, you want to download that. We'll be using MongoDB Atlas for our database. So I've already logged in and created a cluster. So if I click connect and then connect to your application, it'll give me my string here that I can use later on. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Now, if we go to the documentation here, which is it's pretty good actually. There's a lot of it's pretty clear. There's a lot of good examples. What we need to do first is install the CLI globally so that we can generate a project. And with that CLI, we can generate controllers and providers or services, stuff like that. So let's go to our terminal here. And of course, you have to have Node.js installed, which gives you npm. And we're going to say npm install -g, and then it's going to be @NestJS/CLI. Okay, I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run it, but that's what you would do to install it. All right, and then once you have that installed, you just run nest. Actually, you can just make sure you have it installed with -- version, and then you can just do nest new and then your project. So I'm just going to call this nest. We'll call it nest REST API. Okay, so it's going to scaffold up our project. It's going to ask us which package manager we want to use. I'm going to use npm. You can use Yarn if you want. And if you've used Angular at all, you can already tell by looking at these files that it looks very, very similar. It even has the app.module.ts and all that stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and cd into Nest REST API, and I'm just going to go ahead and open up VS Code. All right, so let's take a look. Let's close that up. Let's take a look over here at the files. If we look at our package.json, you can see that this is a pretty big file. As far as dependencies, we have some of the core framework dependencies like NestJS Common, NestJS Core. As I said, it sits on top of Express, so we have this platform Express, reactive extensions, so we can use things like observables. For dev dependencies, we have a bunch of types for Express, Jest, which is a testing platform, NodeMon, which will allow us to run our server and not have to keep restarting it. It'll just constantly watch it. And it even comes with Prettier. It comes with, obviously, TypeScript, TSLint, all that stuff. And if we look at our scripts up here, we have a start script. We have start dev, which will run NodeMon. That's what we'll be using. A debug script, production, stuff for testing down here, end-to-end testing using Jest. A build script, which uses the TypeScript compiler to build out your files, format, which uses Prettier. So lots of stuff in here. And obviously, we're just scratching the surface. This is a crash course, so we're not going to get in depth with every single thing that's available. So let's close that up. And the rest of the stuff in the root is basically just config. So we have our TypeScript config file. We have a NodeMon config. We have our basic CLI config. So that's pretty much it for the root. So let's jump into the source folder, which is where we create everything. And notice that we have all TypeScript files, so everything's going to be .ts. And if we look at main.ts, this is the entry point. Okay, so we have our bootstrap function. Notice it's using async await, so we use a lot of async await with Nest. And this is just going to start the server on port 3000. Okay, and just calls that bootstrap function. So that's the entry point. And then we have our app.module.ts, which is kind of like a meeting place for any controllers or services that we create, just like Angular. If you're familiar with Angular, a lot of this stuff is going to look really, really familiar, and you're already going to basically know how it works. Now, if we generate a controller or service with the CLI, it'll automatically get put in here. It'll get imported, and then it will get put in controllers or providers. Okay, so that's app.module.ts. Now we also have app.controller.ts and app.service.ts, but we're not going to really deal with these because where we have a resource we're dealing with, which is going to be items, we'll have an items folder that will have an items controller, an items service, a module, all that stuff will be encapsulated. So we're not really going to use these files here. Okay, so let's go ahead and generate controller. So I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to use the VS Code integrated terminal, and I'm going to run nest g for generate controller, and I want a controller called items. Okay, so we're just dealing with items, which will have a name, a description, and a quantity. Now, if we look in the source folder, it created a folder for us called items, and anything that we create now that has to do with items is going to go in this folder. And it created a controller file, so items.controller.ts, and then a spec file, which is for testing, but we're not going to deal with that. So the controller file here, you can see it's just importing controller from NestJS common. When you see this @ symbol here, this is a decorator. You're going to see these all over the place when you're using TypeScript. They're basically used for metadata and stuff like that. So this just has the name of our controller items, and then we have our class here, and we'll create functions in this class. Now to run the server, we can go down here. We could do npm start, however, it's not going to constantly watch the server and it won't update our changes. So what we want to do is run npm run start :dev, and that will use nodemon to constantly watch the server and update it. Now, if I go to Postman, I can make a GET request to HTTP. I could do this in the browser as well because it's a GET request. But if I just go to localhost 3000, I get hello world back. So that's just the default. Now, what we want to do is have all of our functionality with items. We want to be able to go to /items. Right now, we're getting a 404 not found. Now, in order to create an endpoint, we use decorators. Okay, so we don't have like a routes file or anything like that. It'll just know automatically. So if I go into my class here, actually, first thing I want to do is I want to import from NestJS common get. Okay, and then I'm going to create a get decorator by doing @get parentheses. And then right under that, I want to create a function, which I'm going to call find all, because that's what I want this to do, is find all items. And for now, I'm going to return a string that says get all items. Now, I'm using TypeScript, okay, or I want to use TypeScript. So this function, as you can see, is returning a string, so I'm going to put :string. And if you've used TypeScript before, if you've used Angular, then this should look very familiar. So, and if I change this to, let's say, a number, I'm going to get this linting error right here. It says type1 is not assignable to type string. In that case, I would have to do number like that. All right, but I'm returning a string, so I'm going to put that back and save. And automatically, since I use this get right here, it's going to tell Nest to create an endpoint for /items. So now if we go back to Postman and I send again, we get this get all items. Okay, so we didn't have to manually create this endpoint, it just knows. Now let's say we want to handle a post request to create a new item. So what we could do is up here, we could bring in post while we're at it, let's just bring in put and delete as well. And we'll go down here and let's do at post, and underneath that, let's create a function called create. Okay, now this create, for now, I'm just going to have return a string. And let's just, for now, return create, what are we using, items, or create item. So just by doing that, I should have the endpoint. Whoops, what happened here? Okay, so that's the get. I'm going to open up a new tab, make a post request to, just copy this. So localhost 3000/items, and we get create item. Now, usually when you send a post request, you're actually creating something, in this case an item. So we need to send data, and in order to do that in Nest, we need to create what's called a DTO, a data transfer object. And if we go to the documentation here, we go to controllers, and let's see, I'm just going to search for DTO right here. So request payloads. So if you use TypeScript, we need to determine the data transfer object schema. So a DTO is an object that defines how the data will be sent over the network. So we need to create a DTO like this. It's a class with some fields. So I'm going to go into my items folder here, and I'm going to actually create a folder inside there called DTO. And inside DTO, I'm going to create a file called create-item.dto.ts. Okay, everything is going to be TypeScript. And we're going to just export a class called create-item.dto. And we're going to mark these as read-only because we shouldn't be able to directly modify these. So we're going to say read-only name, and then the type is going to be a string. Okay, we put a semicolon and then read-only. Let's do description, which will be a string, and let's do read-only quantity, so QTY, which will be a number. So just a map of the fields that we want to be able to send. So we'll save that, and let's go back to our controller here, and we're going to want to bring this DTO into wait a minute, what is this? Import create from domain. I'm not sure why that's there. I'll get rid of that. So let's import create item DTO, and that's going to be from, and let's see, we're in the same folder, so slash and then into the DTO folder, and then we want create item.dto. So down in our create, we're going to want to add into the parentheses right here, we're going to want to use the body decorator, which we actually have to bring in. Okay, so just like in Express you would do requests.body to get your fields, that's basically what we're doing here. We're going to use this at body decorator, and we want to put in the create, whatever we want to call this, which I'm just going to use create item DTO, and then set the type to capital C, create item DTO. Okay, so what we brought in here, this right here, is this. So we're setting this type. And then we should have access to this inside the function, which will have any data that's sent. So for instance, create item DTO.name or .description or .quantity. We should have access to that. So just to check it out, let's do a return. We'll use backticks here, and let's say name colon, and then we'll say create item DTO.name, and we'll say description. And let's do create item DTO dot description. All right, so now if I go back to Postman, I want to make this same post request. However, I'm going to add to the headers a content type because I'm sending data. So I'm going to add a content type of application/JSON, and in the body, I'm going to send raw JSON. So let's do raw, and let's send name. Let's see. So with these are items. I'm just going to say item 1. And let's do QTY, so quantity, we'll say 100, and description, we'll say this is item 1. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and send that, and if we look at our response, we get name, item 1, description, this is item 1. So we can access the fields that are sent in the body now using this DTO. Now, I want to take a little side route here for a second and show you how you can get access to the standard request and response object. Like usually in Express, you'll do something like app.get, you'll have your route, and then you'll have a function, and you'll have this request response. Okay, so you may be wondering, how do we get these objects? So it's not really the NestJS way to do this, but you can do it. So I'm going to show you that real quick. So in addition to the stuff we brought in up here from common, we're going to bring in REQ, RES, and then we need to also import request response from directly from Express. Okay, and then I'm going to give you this example in this find all. So let's say we want to get the request and response object within this function. So I would do @req. I'll call it req, and then this for the type, it's going to be request that I brought in up top. Okay, and then if I want the response, we'll do @res. Call it res. Type is response. Okay, so instead of just returning a string here, I'm going to give you an example of how I can use the request object by just console logging request.url. Okay, URL is just a property within that object. And then I can actually use the response by doing, like, let's say res.send, just like you would in Express. We'll just say hello world. Now this, I'm going to get a TypeScript error because, actually I want to return this, but I'm going to get a TypeScript error because this is not a string, this is a response. So what I would do is change this to the type of response. Now, if I save that, you'll see Prettier just kind of formatted this top part for me. But if I go ahead and make that GET request now to /items, I get hello world. Okay, so res.send and hello world, just like we would in regular Express. So you can access these objects just like this. However, it's not really the Nest way of doing things. So I'm just going to put this back to a string, that, and get rid of this and this, and then the request and response up here. Okay, so if I go back and send, we get all items again. Now, I'm just returning strings for now because ultimately we're going to want to call methods from a service. That's where we want to do everything that has to do with our database, all that stuff. That's going to happen in a service. So right now I'm just showing you how to structure a controller. This stuff, what we're doing inside these functions, is going to ultimately change. All right, so let's move on to getting URL params, okay? Because again, I'm not using the request and response directly, so I'm going to bring in up here param. And I'm going to have a method here. Let's use get, and I'm going to have a method called find1, and we just want this to return 1. Now we need an ID. So inside the decorator, I'm going to pass in :ID, and inside find1, I'm going to pass in @param, and then param. Okay, and then let's just return. I'm actually going to use backticks here, and we're going to say item, and then I can access param.id. Okay, and we're returning a string here. So let's save that. and go to Postman. I'm just going to grab that URL, make a GET request to items/100, or we'll do 1000, that's fine, and send, and we get item 1000. So whatever I pass in right here, 44, that's going to show up right here because we're accessing it with this param. All right, now we could bring in the request object, and we could say request.params, but that's not really the way that we do it with Nest.js. All right, now you can shorten this up if you want by passing in ID like this, and then putting instead of this param right here, putting in ID. So then down here, we could just simply put in ID. So if I save that, whoops, we go back to Postman and send, we still get item 44. Okay, so it's just a cleaner way of doing it. All right, so let's add our last two methods, which are going to be a put and a delete. We already brought in up here put and delete. So let's do let's do our delete. Okay, now to delete, we're going to need an ID, right? So we're going to pass in here, just like we did with the get up above, :ID. And inside here, we're going to use the @param decorator. We'll say, actually, I'm going to just do it like this. We'll do param ID, but we need to pass in ID. Okay, and then I'll just go ahead and return delete ID, and let's just say right here we're returning a string. Okay, we'll try that out. So if we make a delete request to item/44, we get delete 44. Okay, so last one is the update. So let's do @put. So this is also going to need to know which one. So we're going to pass in :ID. Oops, we don't want that. So let's call this update. Okay, so for update, this is going to have a parameter, but we're also adding data. So we also need the body. Okay, we also need body. And just like we did with create, we're going to use that create item DTO. Okay, but I'm going to call this update item DTO, but I'm still going to use create item DTO, so we can just add that as the type. But you could create a different data transfer object if you wanted to for updates. Now, in addition to that, we need the param. So let's do @param, pass in here ID and ID. And then down here, let's just say return. And let's say update ID, and just to make sure we have access to the data that we send, let's just output, we'll say name, and update item to do dot name. Okay, so now if we were to make a put request to, let's say, this right here, /44, let's add in our content type, and it's going to be application JSON. And then for the body, let's do raw. And let's say, we'll just copy it from the post actually. So this right here, let's paste that in. We'll do item 2. So this would essentially update the data, but let's send, and we get item 44. That's because it's a get. We want to do a put. There we go. So update 44, and then we get name item 2. So we're able to access the data we send along with the parameter. So everything here is all set except for what we have happening inside here. Obviously, this isn't what we want to return, but we're going to need a service in order to deal with the database and get the actual data and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just open up a new tab here, and I'm going to generate a service. So I'm going to do Nest G service, and let's say items. All right, now if we look over on the side here, we have an items.service.ts file. And by default, it's just going to bring an injectable. What this does is it allows us to inject this as a dependency into a constructor. All right, now inside this item service, we're going to have a bunch of functions that we're going to call from the controller. But before I do that, I also want to create a module. I want everything to be wrapped up in a module. So inside the items folder, I'm going to create a new file called items.module.ts. And this is going to be set up very similar to the app.module. So I'm actually going to just copy that. So we'll copy that and we'll go to our items module and paste that in. Now all we need is, we don't need the app service or controller, we just need the items controller, which is going to be in the same folder, and then the service, which is in the same folder. And we can get rid of this and get rid of this. Okay, and we'll call this items module. So now everything is encapsulated in this module. So close that up. Let's start on our service. Okay, so for our service, we're going to ultimately work with data from MongoDB, but for now I'm just going to have hard-coded data just to kind of get you guys to understand how this works. Now, we're going to need an interface which explains what fields an item has, okay? Similar to the DTO. But we're going to use the interface within the service. So let's create a new folder inside items, and we're going to call this interfaces. And inside this interfaces, we're going to create a file. Let's call this item.interface.ts. Okay, and this is just a TypeScript interface. If you've worked with Angular, you've probably worked with these before. We're going to say export interface item. So we're going to have an ID. Now I'm going to put a question mark, which means that it's optional, because we're not always going to include the ID because it gets included by the database automatically. And I'm going to just call that a string. Say that an ID is a string. Name, string. We have description, which I'm going to make optional as well, which is a string, and then the quantity, which is a number. And that's it. That's an interface. Pretty simple. It's just the different fields that you want for this particular resource. All right, so let's close that up. And inside of our service, let's bring that interface in. So we'll import item, and that's going to be from /interfaces/item.interface. So inside of our service here, like I said, I'm just going to deal with hard-coded data for the moment. So I'm going to say that this is a private property, read-only, items, call it items, and the type is going to be the interface of item. Now it's an array, so I'm going to put brackets here. Okay, we're going to set it to an array, and let's say this first one, we'll give it an ID. Now MongoDB gives you a long ID. I'm just going to go ahead and just put a bunch of numbers in for the ID. Now notice the red lines here. This is because I labeled this items array as the type of item, okay, or an array of items. And that has to match all the fields that are in the interface, which it doesn't. You can see right here is missing the following properties: name and quantity, okay, because those are required fields. So let's say name item 1 and quantity, let's say 100, and whoops, I didn't mean to do that. So quantity, and you'll see that now the red line goes away because description I put as optional. So description, we'll say this is item 1. All right, and then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll put one more. Item 2, let's say quantity 50, and we'll say this is item 2. All right, so we just have this hard-coded item. Now, back in our controller, this find all, I'm going to want this to return an item, right? So in our service, we're also going to have a find all function. So right under where we defined this, let's create find all. And what I want this to return is an item. Okay, we created the interface of item, we brought it in. I'm going to say this find all has to return an item. And I'm sorry, an array of items. So I'm going to return this dot items. Okay, I can access this right here with this dot items. I can use this because we're inside of a class, and this is a property of that class. So in any method within the class, I can simply reference it with this dot items. Now, this find all I want to call from my controller. Close that up. Let's go into the controller and go into find all. In order to call that, though, I have to bring in the service. So up here, we'll go ahead and import items service, and that's going to be from /items.service. I also want to bring in the interface or the item type. So we'll bring in item from /interfaces/item.interface. Now, before I can actually use the service, I have to inject it as a dependency, and this works pretty much exactly like it does in Angular. So within the class right here, I'm going to add a constructor, and I don't even actually need anything in the constructor body, but within the parameters here is where we inject our dependencies. So I'm going to say private read only, and then let's call it items service, and then set it to uppercase I, items service. Now this can be absolutely anything you want. This, the second one here, is what we brought in up here, the actual item service. So if you wanted to call this something different, you can. But now that I've injected this as a dependency, we can access it with this dot item service dot and then any method within the service, such as find all. All right, so inside the controller, instead of return, actually we still want to return. But instead of just returning a string, we're going to say this dot item service dot find all. Now I'm going to get this TypeScript error because of the string type here, string declaration. This is not a string anymore. It's going to be an array of items. So let's go ahead and save that. And now if we go back to Postman and we go to our original GET request to /items and I send, there they are. Okay, so we get our hard-coded items. Now let's say for this one where we want to return a single item by its ID. So in our service, we'll go ahead and create find one, and this is going to return a single item, so we don't want the brackets here. And we're not dealing with a database yet, so I'm going to go ahead and return this dot items so I can access the items with this dot items, and I'm going to use dot find, which is a high order array method that takes in arrow function. So we'll say for each item we want the one where the item.id is equal to the ID that's passed in, and this will get an ID passed in, which will be a string, because remember IDs are strings. And as far as what this will return is an item, which I already have here. So that should be good. We'll save that, get rid of that. And we should be able to call this from our controller. So back in our controller under find one, instead of doing this, let's say this dot item service dot find. You can see we even have some IntelliSense with the available methods, and we want find one, which takes in an ID, which we can just pass in ID because we already get that from the parameter. Okay, now we're getting an error here because it's not going to be a string, it's going to be item. Okay, no brackets because it's a single item. So let's save that. And let's go back to this GET request where we're actually getting an actual item. And we need one that we need an ID that actually is a real item. So I'm going to grab this one right here. So this is item one's ID. And if I pass this in as a parameter and I send, it gets me item one. All right, so hopefully you can see the pattern here. We just have our controller, which defines the endpoints, gets the parameters or the body if we're creating or updating something, and then simply calls a service method. And that's where we do all of our anything to do with our data. Okay. Now, instead of just creating more service methods where I'm just manipulating hard-coded data, I want to get into using a database because that's what you're going to be doing. This is just, you're not going to have hard-coded data like this. So this is where we get into MongoDB and Mongoose. So I'm actually going to go to the documentation because it explains it pretty well, if I can find where it is actually. I think it's under providers. No. Let's see, WebSockets, fundamentals. It's probably right in front of my face. Is it under controllers? No. You know what? I'm just going to search for Nest JS database. Okay, so here it is. All right, it was under techniques and then database. Now this link here is actually more for using a relational database. So you can use something called the type ORM, and you can connect to MySQL or Postgres or something like that. I'm actually going to click on this next link right here, which is Mongo. Okay, and this will basically tell us everything that we need to do. So we need to install NestJS / Mongoose as well as Mongoose. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we'll do npm install. It's going to be at NestJS / Mongoose and then Mongoose. Okay, and then once we get that installed, what we have to do is add the Mongoose module to the root application module. So remember the app.module.ts, that's like the meeting place for everything. We have to bring in this right here, this Mongoose module. So I'll just go ahead and copy that, and let's go to our app.module.ts and paste that in. So we're importing the Mongoose module, and we need to put that down here. One thing I forgot to do is, remember we created the items module. So where is it? Items.module.ts. We actually have to bring that in to this file as well. So let's import items module, and we want to bring that in from /items/items.module. Now, both the items module and the Mongoose module we want to add to imports. So I'm going to say items module and Mongoose module. Now, we don't just do Mongoose module. We have to do .for root. And then inside this for root is where we put the URI of our MongoDB database. So if I go back to the docs, you can see right here, imports Mongoose module for root, and then the URI string. Now, instead of just putting the URI string directly in there, you should never really do that. So I'm going to create, let's see, I'm going to go in my source folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called config. And inside config, I'll create a file called keys.ts. All right, and this keys file will have any like API keys or anything like that, but in our case, we just have the Mongo URI. So I'm going to export default, and let's say Mongo URI. Now you're going to want to put your own MongoDB URI in here. I'm just going to grab mine real quick. Whoops, looks like I closed up Atlas. So let's say sign in. Okay, so I'm going to say connect to your application, and I'm going to just copy this string here and paste that in, put the password in, and I'm deleting this after anyway, so I don't care if you guys see this. So I'm going to save that. Now we have this in our keys.ts file. So what we're going to want to do now is bring that in to our app.module.ts. So I'll say import. Actually, we exported default, so we don't need the curly braces. So import config from /config/keys, and then right inside here, I'll just do config.mongoURI instead of just putting it right in there. So I think that should be good as far as setting that up. So let's save this, and I just want to go back to the server here and make sure. I'm just going to reset it real quick. So Control C, and then we'll run npm run start dev again. All right, so it looks like everything's okay. If it didn't connect, actually what I'll do is just change something in here to make it wrong. So I'll mess the password up. Okay, so now you can see unable to connect to the database, and it just keeps retrying. So I'll put that back and save, and now we're all set. So you can see how easy it is to implement Mongoose and MongoDB, which is one of the reasons I really like this framework. It's not so, manual as it is with just regular Express. All right, so we have our Mongoose module. We can close up app.module.ts, and let's see, next thing we need to do, if we look at the docs, is we need to create a schema. All right, so let's create a folder inside items. So this items folder right here, I'm going to create a folder called schemas. And let's see, inside schemas, we're going to have one file for our item schema. So new file, call it items. Let's do items dot, or actually let's do item singular, item.schema.ts. All right, so our schema, we want to import Mongoose. Now we're using the import syntax here, not the common JS, the const mongoose require. So we need to do import all as mongoose from mongoose. All right, and then we're going to export. Let's say const item schema. We'll set it to new mongoose.schema. And pass in here an object with our fields. So we want name, it should be string, quantity, number, and description string. So very simple schema, and we'll save that. All right, so we'll close that up. Next thing we want to do, and just to show you in the documentation, so inside our module, so our items module, we're going to want to do this. So bring in Mongoose module and add it to imports, and we just want to call this forFeature method and pass in an array with the name and then the schema name. Okay, we also want to bring in the schema. So let's go to our items module. And I know this seems like a lot of setup, But once this is done, it's done, and you can then, you know, make your queries and go on. So inside our items module, let's bring in, say, import item schema. So item schema is coming from /schemas/ item .schema. Why is that not coming up automatically? Did I not? Schema item.schema.ts. Yeah, so that should be fine. And then we also want to bring in the Mongoose module, so I'm going to just bring that in up here. So that's going to be from Nest JS /Mongoose. All right, then we just want to go into our imports, just like it says in the docs, and say Mongoose module dot for feature, and that's going to take in an array with an object with the name, which is going to be item singular, and then schema, which is going to be our item schema that we brought in. All right, and I think that should be it. I think we should be ready to go. So let's save that. And let me just make sure there's nothing else here. Yeah, so now in our service, we can bring in our inject model from Mongoose. And then we can inject that as a dependency, and we can then use Mongoose. So let's go back to our service. And we can clear out this hard-coded property right here. I can just completely get rid of that. And then up here, let's bring in, let's say import, I want to import model from Mongoose. And we want to import inject model from Nest JS Mongoose. All right, and then down in our class, we need a constructor, okay, because we're using dependency injection. So in this constructor, we're going to do inject or @inject model, and we pass in here item, and let's see, after that, we're going to say private read only, call this item model, and we're going to set that to model that we brought in, which is going to have the type of item. Okay, so now we should be able to say this dot item model dot, and then any Mongoose method like find, create, or whatever, find one, all that stuff, we should now have access to. Okay, so within this find all here, we're going to call dot find. Now Mongoose returns a promise, and I want to use async await just to keep this neat. So we're going to mark this as async, and down here, instead of returning this dot items, which no longer exist, we're going to say return await this dot item model dot find. Okay, now this returns a promise, so this right here, I'm going to get rid of that, and we're going to say promise, and it's going to be the type of an item array. Okay, and let's see, while we're here, we might as well do this, the find one as well. So it takes in an ID, that's not going to change. Instead of just doing this find, which had to do with the hard-coded data, we're going to first of all label this async, and then return await, and let's say this dot item model, and we're going to use find one. Okay, so find one, which takes in an object. We want to match the ID. Okay, MongoDB always gives an underscore ID value, which is an object ID. We're going to match it to the ID that's passed in. Okay, and it's going to return a promise, which will have the type of an item, a single item. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go to our controller now, because this is no longer, we're getting this error because it's now returning a promise. However, we marked it as this item. So all we have to do here is change this to promise item array, and then down here promise item. Okay, now in the controller we also want to mark this as async. So async find all, async find one. And I think that should do it. So let's save this and let's go to Postman. Now, if I make a GET request, we should just get an empty array because there's nothing in the database, which we do. If I go, well, I can't even try the get one, the find one, because we don't have anything to find. All right, so now what we want to do is work on being able to create a new item. So let's go back. Let's go to our service, and we're going to want a method to create a new item in our database. So let's go right here and let's say async create. This will take in an item with the type of item, and we're gonna return a promise of an item. And let's first create a variable. We'll just call this new item, set it to new this dot item model, and pass in that item that's passed in. Okay, and then as far as the return, we're just going to return await, take that new item dot save. And what this will do is return the new, whatever that new item is, it's going to get saved and it's going to return along with the ID that's automatically added by MongoDB. Now we need to call this from the controller, so let's make sure we save this service, go back to the controller where we have our create, and we need to change this up a little bit. So we're still dealing with this with the data transfer object. However, of course, we don't want to do this. We want to instead return this dot item service dot create. And remember, it takes in an item. That item is going to be the DTO. Okay, and instead of the string here, we want promise, and it's going to return that new item. All right, so we'll save that. Let's go to I keep forgetting what this is, Postman, and go to our post request. So we have item 1, quantity 100. Now, once I send this, it should actually get added to the database. So let's go ahead and try it. We'll send. We get a response back with the new item with the ID that MongoDB added. Let's go ahead and add another one. We'll say item 2. Quantity will do 33. This is item 2. If I send that, and let's do one more, 3. And send. Good. So now we should have 3 items in our database. So I'm going to go back to the GET request to /items and send, and now we have all 3 items. Now we should be able to search by one. So let's grab one of these IDs. I'm going to go back to my GET request here where I pass in an ID, and we'll go ahead and send that, and we get item 1. All right, so all those endpoints are working and we're getting the data. So all we have left really is the delete and the update. So let's go back to our service and let's create those methods. Okay, so in our service we'll go under the create, and let's do the delete first. That's a little bit easier. So we'll say async delete. It's going to take in an ID, which is a string. It's going to return a promise. It's going to be an item. And let's do return await. We're going to use the model, so this dot item model, and I'm going to use a method, a Mongoose method called find by ID and remove. So it'll do just that. It'll find it by the ID and remove the IDs getting passed in right here. So let's save this, go back to the controller to where we have our delete, and obviously we want to change that. So for this, let's label this, actually, I'm gonna label, actually we don't need to label these async, do we? I don't think we do. So for the delete, we have the ID, it's going to come from the URL. And then as far as the return, we're going to use the service. So this dot items service, and then we're going to call the delete method, which takes in the ID. And this is going to give us a promise item. So let's try to delete something. So we'll go back, and so this is item 1. Let's delete item 3. So we'll grab this ID, copy that, go to where we have the delete request, go ahead and paste that in, and send. So we get the deleted item back. However, it should be gone. If I go back to the get request and I send again, notice we only have item 1 and item 2. Okay, so we're now able to delete an item. So the last thing we need to do is the update. So back in the service, we're going to go ahead and create, let's say async update. And this is going to take in two things. It's going to take in an ID. It's also going to take in the new item. So item, which will have a type of item. All right. And then as far as what this returns is a promise item. And let's return await this dot item model. Okay, we're dealing with the model. We're going to call the Mongoose method find by ID and update. So find by ID and update. And we're going to pass in the ID. We're going to pass in the item. And then it also takes in some options. And we're going to set new to true. So basically, if there's not one already, it'll create a new one. So save, and you can see how clean this file is, how nice and clean this is. So let's go back to the controller, and this last update method is the last thing that we need to update. So let's see, instead of doing this, let's say return this dot item service dot update. We want to pass in two things. One is the item, I'm sorry, not the item, the ID needs to know which one to update, and then the data is going to be in the DTO, so this right here. So I can simply pass that in and then change the string to a promise with item. All right, so let's try to update something. We'll go back to, let's see, so we have item 1. Let's say we want to update the quantity of item 1. So we'll grab the ID. Right now it's 100, so I'm going to go make a put request to item slash and then that ID. And all I'm going to send here is the quantity. And let's change it to, I don't know, 30. And send. So it gives us the item back with the changed quantity. And if I go back to the get request and send, you'll see that now item 1 has quantity 30. So we have a complete CRUD, create, read, update, and delete REST API. All right, so that's it. Oh, we don't need this async in the controller. I don't know why I thought that, but we shouldn't need that. But yeah, you can see how organized everything is, now how nice and neat. So all your resources would be encapsulated in a folder like this with your interfaces, your data transfer objects, your schemas, your controllers, all that stuff, services, and it's all packaged up nice and neat. So you know, do you need to use Nest JS? No, you can just use Express and create your endpoints and stuff like that. But if you want something that's a little more organized, especially if you're using Angular on the front end, you can see how similar it is in terms of how everything flows together. So I think that having a full stack application with Angular on the front end, Nest JS on the back end, I think is a really good idea and very powerful. So that's it, guys. Hopefully you liked this crash course. If you did, please leave a like, and I will see you next time.